I'm the hottest round. And if you want me, y'all can stop me now. Is you with me now? The biggie bounce. I know you dig the way I switch my style. Get your freak on, 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 get your freak on. People, here I come. Now sweat me when I'm done. Now people gather round. Now people jump around. Get your freak on, get your freak on, get your freak on. Quiet.
I'm knackered.
Hi everyone, welcome back to our second session as part of Voices of Effectiveness. If you recall, the intention of this series is to talk to practitioners in the New Zealand advertising agency world, beyond the big agency networks, and kind of talk to them about some of the campaigns they've either worked on or that their agencies have produced, and tell us the story behind the story of effectiveness and how they set out to solve a client's problem, what insights they drew upon, and how they put together a campaign that then achieved those goals. And along the way, we'll probably naturally chat about some of the ingredients that go into making sure you're going to be more successful rather than less successful, which I think is always a good idea. Last week, we kicked off the series with a great session with Chris Williams, which hopefully some of you will have seen by now. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to this session, live from, well, I'm live in my bedroom, which is slightly awkward, but I don't know where Dan is. He looks like he's in a very posh apartment somewhere in Parnell.
Live from the CEO's office, you know, if the cat's away.
Nice.
Bit of social distancing.
Lovely. So here, really excited to be able to talk to Dan West, who's head of strategy at Stanley Street. And hello, Dan.
Hello.
I'm personally very excited because I've known Dan for 3 or 4 years, and we used to work together at FCB in our old roles. And so it's lovely. Again, one of the joys of this series is that we get to reconnect with people and just have a bit of a correro. But also hopefully reinforce some learning around how we tackle effectiveness. Okay, well, let's, I might do a little brief introduction to what we're going to talk about today. So a kind of alternative title for today's session could have been Two Posh Blokes from the UK Talking About Advertising, which I thought was, might turn off a few of our Heartland New Zealand audience members, but forgive our accents because we've got a lot of very important things to say. And I've always found in my career that as long as you say it in a very posh English accent and stroke your beard, you know, anything you say is taken as gospel. So, you know, I think it's an advantage to have a posh accent in the New Zealand market. But that aside, we're going to talk about a wonderful campaign from a few years back now, but an absolute perler. And we're kind of moving from last week, talking to Chris at King Street. We were talking about a classic Heartland campaign that could only really have been made in New Zealand, Rosie's World, all about changing the perception of dairy farmers. And we looked into the integrated nature of that campaign and how clever it was in its design, and it lasted 9 years. Now we're going to move our focus to the UK from your previous professional life, Dan, when you were working at FCB Inferno.
Yep.
And you were a digital strategist there, and the agency, I believe, pitched for and won the UK Sport, or Sport UK.
Yeah, Sport England. Sport England.
Sport England.
Yep.
Sport England pitch for basically encouraging participation in sport amongst women.
Yeah, it was specifically women in England aged 14 to 40 was the heartland of the brief. Just getting them to do more sports and exercise, and rather than it just being the standard get off of the bus one stop early and walk the rest, or take the stairs rather than the elevator, it was actively participating in sporting activities.
Nice. So the lovely thing about this, and this is where Dan and I betray our perhaps our FCB background, is we love a bit of behaviour change, and this is very much one of those government agency type campaigns. It was a problem around getting people to change their behaviour, change their attitudes to how they thought about sport and how it fitted into their lives amongst a group of the population for whom sport participation was dropping, I gather. Is that right, Dan? Or those were the long-term trends?
They were dropping. They've been dropping over the last 3 years, but it was more the gap between men and women. It was a huge gender gap. So there was 1.75 million less women exercising in England than men. And that was a real concern for Sport England. Not only in terms of building people up from grassroots, but just all the various different health implications that come with being active participants in sport, both with regards to physical health, but also mental health. So they couldn't figure out why there was this huge gap, considering if you looked at other markets in Europe, there was quite a lot of parity between men and women's exercise. So England was quite unique in that gap in that regard.
Okay, so that was kind of the presenting problem, was we've got this gender disparity in sport participation, and of course, what I should say to the audience at home is this resulted in the campaign "This Girl Can," which is a very highly and rightly award-winning campaign, both for effectiveness and creativity. So it's the double, it's the double whammy. It's the holy grail we all hope we'll work on one day in our career. He said one day. Lucky bastard, Dan. Anyway, you got in there early. But these are the magical campaigns that we all hope we get a chance to work on. They both proved themselves to be creatively potent and also ultimately effective. And what we'd love to do is just hear from you. You've talked a little bit about the presenting problem, but take us right back to the beginning of the story and kind of how you guys defined the problem and set about thinking about how to respond to this brief, which was, as you said, in a pitch.
Yeah, I mean, it was, firstly, we were very lucky to have an incredibly, fantastic client in that they really wanted to push it out. They realized it was a really big problem. They didn't want just platitudes of creative. They really wanted to make change happen. So throughout the entire pitch process, when we went back to them to have conversations and put thought starters in front of us, the consistent response was, how can you push it further? How can you push it further? How can you push it further? Which is really exciting from an agency standpoint. And they did that across the board with the other agencies in the pitch process as well. But what was particularly challenging about this brief was just the wall of problems with getting women to engage in sports and activities again. I think we ended up getting about 300 documents worth of information on women in exercise in England. They had reams of spreadsheets, just a whole raft of data to get through. And actually, most of the pitch was dissecting and disseminating all of that information to be able to try and come up with a nugget that you can actually build a creative campaign off. Something that if you solve that problem, you'd unlock everything else. And that was really the nub of it, was just trying to get that together. Because if you think about sport rationally, it should be easy to encourage people to get into exercise. It fires up the dopamines. It's a really social activity. You feel great out of it in terms of health benefits, etc. And when you actually start delving into the data, you've got a whole bunch of women who do not like exercising in front of other people. So that really just slashes through the opportunity of that social message. Some people don't feel great after exercise. They feel knackered and they feel spent, and they don't want to be coming home sweaty and feeling unattractive and lycra and whatnot. So there was so some of those initial solutions ended up being cut away really quite quickly, and then it was just basically faced with a wall of problems. And really the first part of the pitch was working with that data to be able to uncover what that nugget was that sort of brought all of those problems together, really.
And for the purposes of kind of those in the industry that hopefully will see this video or want to learn about how, like, want to learn about that process of, because what you've described is that sifting process that all strategists sort of have to do. We often get overloaded with all the available information that there is. We have too much of it. We know that, to paraphrase that eternal quote about advertising, 50% of the information the client gives me is useless. I just haven't worked out which 50% of it is yet.
Yeah.
That's often what strategists have to do. And we have to get it down to kind of that nub, as you said. What were some of the ways you approached that as a strategy team?
I think we were really fortunate, like I said, with the client, in that they actually gave us the time to go through the data.
Right.
Often as strategists nowadays, we're moving at such pace that we need to respond to briefs almost in an instant. And therefore, it's using your intuition and your experience to be able to quickly filter and go, I think this is the useful stuff that I can build a strategy of. What we were given with this client was, they realized the gravitas of the situation. They realized that it was a really big problem that needed unlocking, and therefore it deserved the time. So a large part of that was, like I said, sifting through that data to be able to at least start to build together some hypotheses. So once you had a number of hypotheses, because whether you go through 100 pages, 200 pages, 300 pages, patterns start to emerge. And so you identify those patterns, start to try and figure out why those patterns are occurring. And then that becomes your hypothesis that you can start putting into other research means. So a lot of our research was formulated around qualitative research.
Yeah.
Quant will get you so far, but in order to really understand human beings and human behavior, it's best to just have a conversation with them. And using qualitative upfront as opposed to using it simply to evaluate creative, it meant that we could basically recreate the coffee morning or the pub chat or whatever it might be, just to be able to just have a conversation with these people and float some of these hypotheses past them, and then see how they as a group interacted as they discussed those particular problems.
Yes. And often you're looking in that forum, you're looking for that kind of, I think the two are really interesting points there. One, the use of qual research early on to try and, once you've sifted through all that data, actually start exploring hypotheses. I did something, I had a very similar experience when we pitched for the British Army when I worked in the UK at Publicis, and we got a whole bunch of potential recruits just to have a pint in the pub. And we worked with the researchers, with the creatives sitting on the next table, and they didn't know they were there, pretty much, and they were just sketching ideas out as they were listening to the conversation that was being facilitated on the table over a pint of Stella Artois, and you kind of get these informal discussions going where people relax. You don't do them in the one-way mirror sort of research zoos. And the second thing is you look at the energy around some of the hypotheses that you put on the table, and that's often a guide. That's really, really interesting.
I don't know if you've seen Brexit, the Uncivil War, which I think is on Netflix.
Yes.
And that, I think that really brings it to life. I think in a really entertaining way, which was, the Tories sat down in a cold white room and a glass window, and there's a bowl of M&Ms in the middle, and you kind of just start putting statements in front of people. Whereas Benedict Cumberbatch headed to the pubs, had a pint, played a game of pool, and just really got under the skin of what was really concerning people. And that's the environment that we were looking to recreate with the qual up front.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great. Good research advice there for any up and coming strategists who want to give advice as to how to mine for great qual insights. Learning outcome. Sorry. So you've done all your sifting, you've done your qual, you took in your hypotheses. So what did you boil it down to? What was your insights that sort of began to form up? And these things don't drop into your lap, so I'm sure it was a little messier than a story could convey. But tell us where you got to.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we were looking for that one unifying barrier, as I was mentioning. We had a whole range of things: lycra, sweat, time, feeling as if you're a bad mother because you've prioritized exercise over time with the family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was actually through the qual that we observed a conversation with a group of women, and it really boiled down to this one thought, which was fear of judgment. And so there's this real fear of judgment, either being judged by others or judging yourself, essentially. And unfortunately, the communications that were out in the wider world, the Adidas's, the Nikes, etc., are really just adding fuel to the fire, because everybody who's exercising in all of those images are stunning models that have got incredible figures, and you look at those images and you go, I'm never going to achieve that, so why bother starting? Because you'll be judged for not achieving your goals or not looking like the ideal vision of a woman based on the sort of the cultural conversations that are happening at the time. So yeah, we really boiled it down to that one barrier, which meant that it gave a very clear role for communications, which was to put it how we succinctly put it, which was to liberate women from the judgments that hold them back.
Nice.
And actually, we didn't end up writing a proposition for the brief that went into creatives. It ended up being almost a note on the back of a napkin, old school Mad Men style. And our head of strategy at the time, Vicky Holgate, wrote, "Women come in all shapes and sizes and all levels of ability. It really doesn't matter if you're rubbish or an expert. The point is that you're a woman and you're doing something." And that basically became the brief that the creatives worked to.
Nice. That's fantastic. And I think that's something that, and again, sorry, I'm conscious and I'm going to own our bias, two posh English white men talking about a campaign aimed at women, but
yes.
Please forgive us for our any inadvertent kind of clumsiness around this subject, but it's something I think I can see, and you have 2 women in your life, Dan. I have 4 women in my life. I can see that as a problem in our culture at a wider level. And as an aside, it's a slightly sad reflection that the fitness market, or the fitness clothing market, actually demotivates people from doing the stuff they claim the stuff they're selling you helps you to do, because they don't actually relate to people's lives and how they genuinely feel about sport. They portray this sort of idealized athlete or high performance kind of persona that you have to sort of be to qualify to sort of make a start, and that's hugely demotivating for people in culture.
100%. It's almost as if you don't look like this, you don't deserve to lace up a boot to a pair of Nikes on your shoes.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get to looking like the way I am without serious hard work in the gym.
and you look fantastic. Haircut from your daughter and all.
Absolutely. I'd just like to point out my daughter cut my hair, which I'm very proud of, having a very paternally proud moment there, that my wife now has come out of lockdown with a working skill, hairdressing. I'm very pleased with that.
She's done a great job.
Anyway, let's get back on track. Sorry, Dan. So that's a wonderful way to, again, convey the essence of what the role for communications is, and what the role for the idea needs to, what role that idea needs to play in addressing that central barrier that's holding women back from participating in sport. So then kind of what happened next, and let's talk about creative development, and let's talk about channel strategy as well at the same time.
Sure. I mean, creative development was an interesting one, because the creatives came back with a couple of options. And one of the options that they came back with was directly facing the statement, like a girl. And, can we turn like a girl into a positive? And then, interestingly enough, 3 months later, outcome always with their Like a Girl campaign. But we had felt before that happened that we didn't want to focus on a negative. If one of the fears of judgment wasn't just simply external judgment, but internal judgment as well, it needed to be something that was empowering, essentially, and just sort of taking the external of like a girl, we wanted to focus more on the internal of what it means to be a girl, and therefore the creative idea, as you mentioned earlier, was This Girl Can. which became a really, really powerful rallying cry, essentially. In terms of the creative development, the way that the team wanted to bring it to life was to firstly use real women. And I use real women in inverted commas because obviously everyone is a real woman, but it was the everyday woman as opposed to the model or the athlete. So everyone that was in the advertising campaign was street cast. And it was just an absolute phenomenal producer playing a bit of a stalker and interrupting people as they ran around different fields and played hockey and whatever else, and interrupted them and say, "Hey, do you mind being in an ad?" And the second thing was providing women with witty ripostes that they could throw back in the face of judgment. So just sort of these one-liners that if they were either feeling judged themselves or were feeling as if they were being judged by others, they could either internally or even if they wanted to externally just use this line to be able to feel empowered to continue on their sporting journey.
Fantastic. And I sense that need to reinforce and to give people justification for taking that first step sort of segues us nicely into the role of the digital campaign.
Yeah, I mean,
fair to say.
I definitely. I think it was interesting because when we built out the customer journey for this particular campaign, or indeed women's relationship with sports over their lifetimes, what you found is that you didn't move back one stage. You could go all the way back to the beginning, even if you were the biggest sports star in the world. So a life event, for instance, having a child. Now, all of a sudden, you're no longer able to perform at the level that you once were for various different reasons. And then you can basically disregard sport because you've prioritized something else in your life. And so it was quickly identified that we needed to engage with people across all aspects of that customer journey. And therefore, in order to be able to do that, digital became a really important way of achieving that, especially as people move more and more into the online world for inspiration and encouragement. You see even now the lockdown is a prime example of that, of people posting up their fitness videos, people looking for advice, sharing their stories, and looking for support and encouragement throughout sort of quite a difficult time.
Yeah. And were there any specific ways in which you used the different social channels? Because you've got a myriad of channels. It's easy to say, oh, we did a digital campaign. But you were very precise. And I think one of the learnings from this campaign is about how you understood people's interactions with the different channels and platforms.
Yeah, definitely.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
No, of course. So what we ended up doing after having built the customer journey out was really defining what the phases are of the campaign. And now those phases completely overlapped, but by identifying those phases, it gave a very clear role for the communications within those phases. So the first phase was realization, and that was just sort of waking up our audience to the idea that there is judgment that they're facing, and helping them sort of almost have that light bulb moment of, oh, okay, that's maybe the way I've been behaving the way that I have been behaving. So just sort of putting that into the spotlight a little bit, this sort of fear of judgment, as well as just having conversations and celebrating the women that were starting on this journey, essentially. So that was the first phase. And the second phase was really about sort of exploding it out through inspiration. So just inspiring the rest of the nation to get out there and involve themselves in some sporting activity or another. And then the final phase was really just identifying with the campaign, being a government, well, being any campaign, you have a finite amount of money, but it's a problem or a challenge that will persist over a number of years. So if you can get your audience to own it, it's the holy grail, because then you can continue it without having to invest as much financial resources into it. So in terms of those three phases, it gave us a really clear role for each one of those channels, especially the digital ones. So in terms of that realization phase, we actually created a suite of 6 pieces of content that I think they were about 30 seconds long. and they directly focused on some of the key barriers that we had noticed within the research. One of them was sweat, for instance. Another was lycra. Another one was time with family. And then we actually partnered with 3 of the largest newspapers, so broadcast newspapers, so Telegraph, Guardian, Times. And we basically separated out those 6 videos. So each one of them got 2 videos exclusively to them. And so therefore they were more likely to put that content out onto their channels, talk about it, get people excited about it. And it also allowed us to provide long form digital content to actually explain the problem and give a little bit of depth and a bit of context to everything. The other part of that particular phase was we used a social listening tool and built out an algorithm within it to be able to identify any conversations that women in our target audience were having around sports and activities. So if somebody had written a post that says, completely failed, went to the gym, managed 3 press-ups and went home, we would engage them and say, look, 3 more is more than most people have done today. Don't worry, tomorrow's a new day, keep it up. Because we wanted to act as like the best friend. We didn't want to act like the personal trainer that Nike and Adidas tend to play in, because we realized that actually wasn't as motivating as you might think. The other thing that we did is that if we wanted to be a true best friend, we needed to maintain engagement with them. So that meant that if they did make a post like the one I just mentioned, failed in the gym, we might send them a message a week later going, hey, how's it going now? Did he make it back in there again? So try and encourage it. If somebody had written training for a marathon in 3 months' time, we would take a note of that and actually engage with them in 3 months' time and say, so did you manage to do it? How did the marathon go? Tell us all about it. And so it really created what our head of strategy called an army of Tinkerbells, which I thought was a really cute term. If you have trolls, which are the ones that try and knock you down and find fault, the Tinkerbells are the ones that lift you up and become your advocates online. Awesome. So it was sort of building out an army of those guys just by having those conversations, sharing their content, amplifying their voices, and providing that sort of deep form content through those 6 videos and those articles. And then when it came to the inspiration stage, it just made our lives a lot easier, because as soon as the TV went out and it got put out into social media and out of home, we had this army of Tinkerbells to rely on, because they then came out in force going, have you seen this campaign? These are the guys that I've been talking to you about. These are the ones that have inspired me to go back to the gym, etc. So there was a lot of positive chatter online about it. It also meant that we didn't have to do as much when it came to community management, because you had a number of people who took a little bit of umbrage with the word girl, for instance. If we're targeting women from 14 to 40, for some, understandably, it felt as if the language was infantilizing them. So a number of our Tinkerbells came back and said, look, you're missing the point here. And secondly, we still talk about having girls' nights out. So, the rhetoric isn't, don't get too bogged down in it. And also we had the research to back up why we use that particular word in the first place. And the other thing is that we did have a lot of middle-aged white men come out in force and say, well, men can as well. We should have a This Man Can campaign too. Once again, missing the point entirely.
So patriarchy.
Exactly. Once again, we had our audience come out, our Tinkerbells come out in full force. So just making that phase of the campaign a lot more helpful. And then the other sort of subset of that campaign was realizing that we still needed to address all those various different barriers again, or as well. And so identifying the different channels that were best placed at solving those particular barriers. So Instagram we turn to as a platform that is about inspiration, and we look there for beautiful images and wonderful quotes, etc. So what we look to do is take some of the quotes that our audience had made, our Tinkerbells, putting them into a beautiful Instagram shot and publishing those on Instagram in order to be able to inspire our audience through almost a herding effect of, oh, this is what others have done, I can get involved in this as well. Twitter is much more of a kind of FOMO platform. It's here and now information. So that was an opportunity opportunity for us to be able to surface the kind of sporting events that are happening on your doorstep in order to be able to encourage people to pursue a sport here and now, not put it off. And Facebook was an opportunity to create a bit of a community for people to be able to talk to one another. Now, we never expected our Facebook page to become a community as a whole. Followers is no longer the thing on Facebook. We weren't looking for them. But what we did find is that we were creating micro communities under the pieces of content. So talking about rollerblading, or I'm trying to remember what the name of the film is, like with Drew Barrymore, where they roller skate around. Roller derby. Thank you. Yeah. So roller derby. Yeah, right. That's it. Yep. So roller derby, and you had a whole bunch of people who are roller derby fans getting excited about this content.
Kick-ass? Is that?
Oh no, that's something else.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. But yeah, so we had the fans of roller derby take that content, make it their own, push it out to all their friends and family, and just expand it out and start this mini community under the content. And then finally, our website was based on this, on these two particular barriers that we'd identified. One, which was that when you say the word sport, for a lot of people, it conjures up happy hockey sticks and running around a field in the freezing cold and the rain and short skirts while you get shouted at, which is not a very positive image. The website, therefore, was to help people find the sport that was right for them. Yeah. So just show that there's actually, over 100 different types of sports out there for all abilities and desires, or however you want to phrase it. And really, it's just a case of finding the right one for you. And there was one way which was allowed you to filter it down to the thing that you might want, or there was a serendipitous button, which was a real nice behavioral economics technique of just going, let's just see what's out there. And that created a lot of engagement as well. The other thing that the website was there to do was surface some of the women in our advertising to show their stories, that they are real women, and then to allow our audience to share their stories, so that it created a bit of a community. And to that effect, we also put a content aggregator system on the website to bring in all the content from across the UK, so that it created that herding effect and that groundswell of, this is a movement that I want to be involved in.
Yeah, fantastic. I just love the fact that this is digital by design. This is social media by design. This is not we'll just kick it out there and see what happens. This is, you guys had done the work to understand how your audience interacted with platforms, the context for channel, and then you tooled work and expressions of the campaign to flourish in those environments. And I think it's such a good example of a campaign that has a lot of moving parts in digital, but again, as my old man used to say to me, everything in its place and everything place for everything. It's like there's something very satisfying about listening to that, and there's a lot that we can learn from that, because it's all insight driven. It's not just, we did it because it was a thing to do. To drive effectiveness. And let's now talk about the effectiveness, because we haven't talked about that so far. But as you were developing and taking the brief and the pitch, and as you were developing you were identifying the role for communications and defeating that barrier of fear and judgment, how were you thinking about effectiveness? What was your approach as a team to effectiveness?
So effectiveness was baked in from the beginning. And by that, I mean, obviously we wanted it to be effective. So, baked in from the beginning in that sense. But, exactly. Rather than going, this will be fun.
And people don't. May surprise some of our, 5 of our viewers to discover that.
But being a government campaign, we were obviously going to be rigorously reviewed. This is taxpayers' dollars, and we needed to ensure that what we were doing was going to be effective. So up front, we'd actually identified all the various different ways in which we were going to analyze the effectiveness of the campaign. And there was a huge raft of different data points. So there was the government-owned research that they do on both monthly sort of stick into the marketplace, and then a quarterly deep dive into the marketplace. So that was able to allow us to see how we were tracking over the year, but also allow us to pivot if need be in terms of some of the messages that might need to be elevated, some of the messages that actually need to be taken off the table because they simply weren't resonating. The other thing that we had, because social media was such a core part of the campaign, core component of the campaign, we had social media listing tracking set up from the very beginning across all the various different platforms, Instagram, Twitter, to a certain extent Facebook. Obviously it's a closed platform, so you can only go so far with it, as well as news articles, forums, etc. So that allowed us to gauge the mood of the nation and whether or not people were on our side, whether or not we needed to up the sort of brand love, as it were, to be able to be more effective, up the emotion, whether there were certain questions that people had. I mentioned roller derby earlier as a piece of content, and that was done through social listening to see that there was actually quite a groundswell from the roller derby associations to say, hey, we want you to talk about us. So we reached out to them, we asked for a photograph, they sent us a bunch through, took the best one, did a little bit of an edit to it, and made it as an aspect of the campaign. So that ability to pivot to our audience need was very important, and that was done through primarily social listening. But we also used other tools to be able to see whether or not we were trending. If you're creating a movement, you need people talking about it. So we needed to be trending in terms of search, Twitter, etc. There were also some key codes. Mark Ritson talks a lot about codes within communication. And we'd identified some of our key codes, such as those witty riposts that I talked about. So we wanted to measure whether or not they were entering the common parlance and the psyche, and were people using the phrase "this girl can." We actually found through social listening that one woman had actually tattooed "this girl can" on her foot in order to be able to inspire her to keep exercising. So it was really a powerful message, which was great. And then we even measured the Missy Elliott soundtrack. So are we getting more people to listen to the soundtrack because they're finding it empowering and they have an association between the music and the message? So it was quite a extensive collection of data sources, but it wasn't done haphazardly. It wasn't like, right, campaign's over, what should we look for? This had all been, as you said, designed up front in order to be able to ensure that we were effective at the end, but that we could optimize throughout.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big learnings about knowing what you're trying to measure for from the get-go allows you to optimize. Whereas if you do that, slightly lazier attitude of, well, we just let the campaign fly and then, it seemed to be quite successful. We could probably enter an award with that. Let's go and find all the data and post-rationalize it. You've missed that whole opportunity to optimize. And that's one thing that digital gives you the opportunity to do, is get those feedback loops ongoing, as well as keeping some of the core elements consistent. So I think it's, again, another great case study for the interplay between larger TV video assets and then really smart audience insights and particular development of creative and content that was permeating through communities and social channels.
I think what was also interesting was that interrelationship between offline advertising creating online content. So we had quite a few people use the out-of-home print as a background for creating social content to show that they were in support of the campaign. We actually worked with Marks and Spencers to be able to create a line of merchandising, specifically sportswear, so t-shirts, tracksuit bottoms, etc., that had the "This Girl Can" logo in the first round, and then we re-released it a few months later with some of the lines on it, and that got sold out online within weeks. And the outcome of that was that people wearing the t-shirts and wearing the tracksuits would take photographs of themselves in that merchandise to be able to once again generate more content for us, because we needed, in order to be able to create a movement, to flood the market with our message.
So there's a big badging effect going on there. It's kind of cool. And I guess in terms of am I right in understanding, Dan, that the campaign's still running? The platform's still going in the UK?
It is, yeah. They released
fantastic.
They released a recent update a few months ago. So it usually goes through iterations every 2 years.
Yeah, that's right. Because I remember the second back in 2017. I think when I was still working at FCB, I remember Vicky sharing at a conference the sort of sneak preview of the next iteration of the TV work, and therefore that would set in train the second wave of the campaign. And that was sort of 2 years later, wasn't it? Because it launched in 2015.
Yep.
And so here we are 5 years later. So again, we talked to Chris last week about 9 years of Rosie's World. We're talking here about This Girl Can, 5 years of proven effectiveness. And it has been peer reviewed at the IPA and done extremely well at, arguably the Champions League of effectiveness. And at effectiveness award shows where clients and industry peers have peer reviewed the data and the story of the campaign. So all of that sort of development of the designing of the campaign, the refreshing of the campaign, has really paid off to create this platform that goes on. And in terms of I know you've been away from the team that have done it because you've moved to New Zealand subsequently, but from your understanding, how has the success of the campaign evolved over that period?
It's really just they've taken the brand platform and the core essence of the campaign, and then realized how behaviors have shifted over time, and what it has achieved and what it hasn't achieved, and therefore just moving the needle ever so slightly to point at the things that it needs to ramp up. So, for instance, when it came to the 2017 campaign, it was less directly about the judgment women might be feeling, and a little bit more about the expression of their confidence and sense of belonging in the world of exercise. Yeah. So we'd shifted. So judgment was still a component of it, but it wasn't the core focus. Yeah. Now it was about confidence and belonging. And so therefore the creative just shifted slightly into that particular area. And also when it comes to belonging, it expanded the campaign out into sort of greater cultural diversity, really, and greater sort of life situations, so that everybody could feel as if they were part of the campaign. Yeah. So that was the 2015 iteration. And then the 2017 iteration was delivered primarily through digital channels, and was targeted at women who in particular found it difficult to get involved in sporting activities, primarily due to budget and time. Yeah. So it was a lot of it was focused on the little exercises that you can do at home or in the park, going for a run, a swim at the beach, turning bags of flour into weights. If that had been launched in lockdown, it would have been like the perfect lockdown video.
I was going to say more timely than ever.
Exactly. And it is basically giving that sort of confidence and removing the fear of judgment, but also removing more of the practical barriers, really, and the practical barriers that we have all experienced through lockdown, but is unfortunately the norm for many people out there.
Yeah, that's right. All of us sort of going, oh no, I can't get to the gym. Well, we're slightly more privileged than the average person who's struggling to get on top of their health and feel good about the exercise that they're taking.
Exactly.
It's all relative, So, well, look, I just wanted to finish we asked Chris the same question last week, like stepping back on the campaign and your involvement in it. What would be some real learnings that you would say to young people coming up through the industry, maybe young planners, young suits who want to sharpen their strategic chops and are involved in campaign development? What are the key learnings you take out of this for them?
So I'll try and boil it down to 3, so that we're nice and succinct. Yeah.
Learning outcomes.
The first one is do the research. So spend the time to get the insights. And yes, there might be times when time is tight and you need to just get something into the creative teams. But there are ways in which you can speed things up a little bit by, as you were saying, Murray, head to the pub, have a conversation with people. I can't remember who it was who famously said your audience is your wife. And so your audience is your wife, your mate, the rugby club, etc. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, so go and have a conversation with these people. See if if you need it. See if you can get $50 from the boss and buy a round for the people and have a chat. Because after you've brought them around, they're more than happy to have a conversation with you. So, don't be afraid to get out there and have some conversations to really understand your audience. Because if you can understand your audience and get to a clear insight, that allows you to do really effective work. The second one is really just repeating what you said, Murray, which was everything has its place. So ensuring that what you're doing has a genuine role in the objective that you're trying to achieve. I mean, one of my personal bugbears is we often go, oh, we need content. Okay, great. To do what? What is the role of that particular piece of content? Are you trying to use that content to drive sales? Are you trying to use that content to drive market share? What is that content's role? And then how are you going to see if that actually has worked? So, what are the metrics that you're basing it on, rather than just simply likes and clicks, for instance. And then the third one kind of just leans off that, which is having a clear measurement framework in place the moment you start the campaign. And we encourage people who write briefs at Stanley Street to be able to say, not just what the objective is, but how do we know when we've got there? And to not only put the numbers in that say, I need to get from 8% to 10%, but actually to say, and how am I going to measure 8% to 10%? What is the tool that I'm going to use? Because it focuses the mind on ensuring that what you're suggesting has a genuine role and isn't superfluous and essentially a waste of money for the client and a waste of time for you.
Well said. Well said. Yes. No, I think that's a great question that everyone should be asking themselves, no matter what agency or even if you're client side, like, yes, we've stated some objectives, but how will we know when we've achieved them? And how are we going to make an account of that beyond reasonable doubt that it was our inputs and our work and our effort and our creative and our deployment of creativity that actually drove that result? And the sooner we ask that, as you say, it sharpens the mind.
Completely, and that's what your job as a strategist is to do, is to sharpen things.
Nicely done. Oh well, look, Dan, thank you so much for sharing the story of This Girl Can. It's live and out there on the internet, but also I personally just want to say thank you as a father of 3 girls. That it's the sort of stuff that makes me always think that's the kind of girls I want to bring into the world and grow up and help nurture. So from a very personal point of view, I just think it rocks. So well done to you and the team at the time, and I think you've made the world a better place.
Thank you. Yeah, as a dad of a little girl, I feel very much the same way. It's nice to have it on the CV, but regardless, it's just nice that it's out there, because I still hear from people who've got young girls who maybe weren't around at the time of the campaign launch, who now just show it to them because they feel that it's something that's valuable for them to see.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you very, very much, Murray. Thank you very much, Dan. And incredible campaign. And thanks so much for sharing it with us.
Welcome. And I urge anyone who's watching this to just head onto YouTube, type in This Girl Can, and you'll see the campaign in its fullest.